Hissène Habré was born on August 13, 1942 in Fialarjo, a remote town in northern Chad, during the period when the country was under French colonial rule. He was born into the Anakaza branch of the Tubu ethnic group, a nomadic people of the Sahara. His early life was shaped by the harsh desert environment and the deep sense of independence that defined his community. Growing up among the Tubu, Habré experienced a traditional lifestyle but also witnessed the inequalities of colonial administration, where local communities often felt neglected and oppressed by the French authorities. As a child, Habré was sent to mission schools where he excelled in his studies. His intelligence quickly caught the attention of his teachers, who encouraged him to pursue higher education. By the late 1950s, Chad was experiencing political turbulence as nationalist movements gained strength and colonial powers prepared for decolonization. Habré, like many of his generation, was inspired by the wave of independence movements across Africa. He left Chad to study in France, attending the prestigious Institut d'études politiques in Paris, commonly known as Sciences Po. There, he studied law and political science, immersing himself in revolutionary ideas and the philosophies of anti-colonial struggle. During his years in France, Habré became politically active. He joined student groups and closely followed debates about socialism, Pan-Africanism, and the future of post-colonial Africa. Influenced by leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Ahmed Sékou Touré, Habré began to envision himself as part of the new generation of African leaders who would liberate their nations from foreign influence. Yet his ambitions were not purely ideological. Even at this stage, Habré displayed traits of personal ambition and ruthlessness that would define his later career. In the early 1970s, Chad was engulfed in civil conflict. After independence in 1960, the country struggled with divisions between the Muslim North and the predominantly Christian and animist South. The first president, François Tombalbaye, faced opposition from various rebel groups, particularly in the north. Habré returned to Chad in this climate and joined the rebellion. He became a key figure in the Forces Armées du Nord, a rebel movement largely made up of Tubu fighters who sought to challenge southern domination of the government. Habré quickly rose in rank due to his charisma, military skill, and ability to attract support. In 1974, Habré made international headlines when his rebel group kidnapped the French anthropologist François Closter and two other Europeans in the Tibesti Mountains. The hostage crisis brought global attention to Habré, marking him as a ruthless and uncompromising leader. Though the hostages were eventually released, the incident strained relations between Chad and France and demonstrated Habré's willingness to use violence to achieve political aims. Throughout the 1970s, Habré maneuvered between alliances and rivalries in Chad's fragmented political landscape. He was briefly appointed Prime Minister in 1978 as part of a coalition government led by President Félix Malhoum, but the arrangement soon collapsed. Habré withdrew his forces and launched new offensives against the government. His reputation as a fierce military commander grew, and he attracted both foreign supporters and enemies. During this period, Chad became a battleground in the Cold War. France sought to maintain influence in its former colony, while Libya under Muammar Gaddafi supported rival factions in an attempt to extend Libyan control into northern Chad. The United States, fearful of Libyan expansionism, began to see Habré as a potential ally. This convergence of interests would prove decisive in his rise to power. In June 1982, Habré and his forces entered the capital city, N'Djamena, after a long and bloody campaign. He declared himself president, overthrowing the government of Goukouni Ouaddaï, who had been backed by Libya. Habré's victory was celebrated by his supporters as a triumph of northern resistance, but it also marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Chad's history. As president, Habré established a regime that combined authoritarian control with intense repression of opposition. He created a feared secret police known as the Direction de la Documentation et de la Secu right, or DDS. The DDS carried out surveillance, arrests, torture, and executions of anyone suspected of opposing the government. Political parties were banned, dissent was crushed, and entire ethnic groups were targeted as threats to the regime. Reports later revealed that during Habré's 8 years in power, tens of thousands of people were killed, and countless others were imprisoned or tortured. Yet Habré's rule was not marked only by brutality. On the international stage, he positioned himself as a bulwark against Libyan aggression. Gaddafi had long claimed the Awazou Strip, a region along the Chad-Libya border. Habré fought against Libyan troops with determination, often with direct support from France and covert assistance from the United States. Washington saw him as a valuable ally in containing Gaddafi's influence in Africa, and as a result, Habré received military aid, weapons, and training. At the same time, Habré implemented policies aimed at modernizing parts of Chad's economy. He invested in infrastructure projects, encouraged education, and worked to strengthen ties with Western nations. However, these achievements were overshadowed by the climate of fear that defined his government. The brutality of the DDS created an environment where citizens lived in constant fear of arrest, torture, or disappearance. By the mid-1980s, Habré was firmly in control of Chad, but his power rested on repression and external support. His rise from a desert village to the presidency was a story of ambition and determination, but it came at a heavy cost to his countrymen. Thousands of families mourned relatives lost to his prisons, while others fled into exile to escape persecution. This first part of the story of Hissène Habré shows the journey of a man shaped by colonial injustice, driven by ambition, and hardened by years of rebellion. His rule as president of Chad reflected both his military cunning and his authoritarian tendencies. The second part of his biography will trace how his reign eventually collapsed, how his people overthrew him, his years in exile, and his unprecedented trial for crimes against humanity. Hissène Habré's grip on Chad began to weaken by the late 1980s, even though he still enjoyed support from France and the United States. His continued battles with Libyan forces drained the country's resources, and while he achieved military victories, the cost was devastating for ordinary citizens. The repression of ethnic groups such as the Sera, Hadjari, and Zaghawa created deep divisions in Chadian society. The DDS, his security apparatus, carried out widespread torture, forced disappearances, and executions. Survivors later recounted harrowing stories of prison camps where starvation, electric shocks, and beatings were routine. Although Habré presented himself as a nationalist hero who had defended Chad against Libyan encroachment, his government's systematic repression alienated many within the country. Corruption grew rampant, with state funds diverted to maintain loyalty among his inner circle. Poverty worsened, and resentment festered among groups excluded from power. His reliance on violent control rather than genuine political consensus meant that the foundations of his rule were always fragile. In December 1990, his own former military commander, Idriss Déby, launched a rebellion with support from Sudan and other regional backers. Déby's forces advanced rapidly, and by the time they reached the capital N'Djamena, Habré's support base had crumbled. Without the will or capacity to fight, Habré fled the country, taking refuge in Senegal. His fall was sudden, reflecting how little legitimacy he had beyond the machinery of terror. In exile, Habré lived in relative comfort in Dakar, Senegal. He remained silent about his rule, while thousands of survivors of his regime began demanding justice. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch gathered testimonies from victims and documented the atrocities committed by the DDS. By the early 2000s, calls for Habre's trial grew louder, making him a symbol of the struggle for accountability in Africa. Despite this, legal efforts to prosecute him faced delays. Senegal hesitated to put him on trial, and international legal complexities slowed progress, yet survivors of his regime, many of whom had lost family members or endured torture, continued their campaign with remarkable determination. Their persistence became a landmark in international justice, as it was rare for African leaders to be tried for crimes committed in office. In 2013, after decades of pressure, the Extraordinary African Chambers was established in Senegal with support from the African Union. It was the first court of its kind, created to prosecute crimes committed by an African leader in another African country. Habré was arrested in 2013, and his trial began in 2015. For survivors, it was a historic moment. They faced their former dictator in court, describing in detail the horrors they endured. In May 2016, Hissène Habré was found guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and torture. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict marked the first time in modern history that an African leader was convicted in the courts of another African nation for human rights violations. It was celebrated as a victory for justice and a warning to authoritarian leaders that impunity would not last forever. During the trial, evidence revealed the scale of the atrocities committed under his rule. An estimated 40,000 people were killed, and over 200,000 were subjected to torture, imprisonment, or persecution. Mass graves were uncovered, and documents from the DDS archives provided undeniable proof of the systematic nature of the abuses. Habré began serving his sentence in Senegal, where he spent the final years of his life in prison. He contracted COVID-19 during the global pandemic and died on August 24, 2021 at the age of 79. His death closed the chapter on a leader whose life had been marked by rebellion, dictatorship, brutality, and ultimately justice. The story of Hissène Habré is one of rise and fall. He came from the remote deserts of northern Chad, fought his way to power through determination and violence, and ruled with an iron fist supported by foreign allies. His years as president brought both national defense against external threats and internal terror against his own people. Unlike many dictators who died in power, Habré was forced to face his victims and be judged by a court of law. His conviction remains a landmark in the global fight against impunity and a reminder that even the most powerful leaders can one day be held accountable. Habré's legacy is deeply polarizing. To some, he will be remembered as the man who resisted Libyan domination and preserved Chad's independence. To many others, he will forever be associated with the torture chambers of the DDS, the mass killings, and the climate of fear he imposed. His story illustrates both the possibilities and dangers of leadership in post-colonial Africa, where ambition, foreign intervention, and ethnic divisions combine to produce decades of turmoil. In the end, Habré's life is a cautionary tale. It shows how a man who began with ideals of liberation and independence became consumed by the quest for absolute power, sacrificing justice, humanity, and the welfare of his people. His trial and conviction stand as a testament to the resilience of survivors and the slow but certain pursuit of justice.